The Nelli Stevenson Show is recorded on Wurundjeri country. Welcome to the Nelli Stevenson Show. Today's episode is brought to you by the fact that I pay more tax than major multinational gas companies do in Australia. So, you may have noticed that recently debate has been absolutely raging about the idea that we finally need a fair return on our gas in Australia, that we're getting completely and utterly ripped off by multinational gas companies who dig our gas out of the ground, pay next to no tax and ship 80% of it overseas. Now, the going rate that people from trade unions, the climate movement, the crossbench, energy analysts are all calling for is a flat 25% export tax. And so I'm finding this a particularly interesting moment in history. In over a decade of working in climate and energy in Australia as a communications strategist, I've actually never seen anything like this. I'm acutely aware of public opinion as part of my work, and I know for certain that Australians are deeply disinterested in energy policy. No matter how engaged they are in climate, they really don't give a shit about coal, about gas, about energy policy more broadly. It's just a really uninteresting topic. And so not only are we seeing an overwhelming amount of people getting involved in energy policy, they're also loudly calling for a new tax, which traditionally Australians don't very much like. And a lot of people are seeing this 25% export tax figure and thinking, well, hang on, Norway taxes their gas industry at 78%. Why not go the whole hog? And so I've been dying to talk to our guest today. He's uniquely placed to comment on this as an Australian energy analyst living in Norway. Today's guest is Ketan Joshi, and I'm thrilled to have him on the show. Ketan Joshi, welcome to the show.
Hello. It's really lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. So, Ketan, you're based in Norway. You're an Australian living in Norway. When you watch the Australian gas debate, what seems the most bizarre to you?
I can relate to a lot of the weirdness of the Australian gas debate because it shows up here in Norway, particularly this whole absurd idea that somehow we're kind of running short on gas. Right? It manifests here as this whole idea that Norway is the savior of Europe. We're kind of like, riding into Europe on a fossil fuel horse and saving everybody from having to rely on Russian gas.
The bad gas, as opposed to the good Norwegian gas, the bad Russian gas.
Yeah, our democratic and clean gas, which basically is the same shit when you burn it as Russian gas, is just amazing and heroic. And we are kind of like selflessly saving Europe. And it's based on this idea of like, there's just not enough gas, right? Like we just need to keep digging it up. We need to keep extracting. And the only way to do that is if the experts in digging up fossil fuels just do more of it. And so like, I'm sure all of that sounds really familiar, right? Which is like...
No, I've never heard any of this before.
Like you see stuff like, we have such a shortage of gas in Australia, there's just not enough. And it is so absurd. Like, I think that could possibly be the worst lie that they tell, which is just this idea, like they export such a huge volume of it. It's like working at a toilet paper factory and just using the toilets in the office. And they're just like, I'm sorry, we ran out of toilet paper. Like, I don't know how to fix it.
Not even one ply? You can't spare a square?
Yes, nice Seinfeld reference. Very nice. Yeah, it's just absurd, right? Like it makes absolutely no sense. And the argument in itself is absurd, but what makes it like tragicomic, like an episode of Seinfeld, is that this is like a widely accepted argument. You read this in like media outlets and they're like, oh yes, we do have a gas shortage. That's true. What a reasonable thing to say. And I'm just like, how can you treat that as like a normal business statement that everybody kind of accepts as a given? I cannot, it just blows my mind. And so, yeah, I reckon that's the one thing, like when I look at the Australian gas debate and I look at the Norwegian/European gas debate, that is just this one commonality where you have the whole thing is predicated on an absurd premise. And it's kind of shared between the two countries that everyone's like, let's just treat this really absurd premise as if it's just a normal thing and never question it.
It's unbelievable. And so what has been happening in Australia, as you well know, is that suddenly everyone's really getting behind this idea of a 25% gas export tax. And in my line of work, I'm really deeply aware of social license to operate and how much of a social license the gas industry has created for itself in Australia through, I'm going to just call it through propaganda, through disinformation, through misleading advertising, through cherry picking data. And what I'm curious to know is when people in this conversation in Australia start saying, well, 25% enough, fuck it, let's go the full Norway, let's let her rip and go to 75%. What does that do to the gas industry's social license?
The gas industry here in Norway already has, a really like an iron grip on society and culture. It is remarkable how hard it is to avoid any of its presence, no matter what you do or which thing you speak. I'm speaking at a conference tomorrow, and one of the sponsors is, Norway's state-owned fossil fuel company. And if I were to set as a standard, like, don't do any public engagements with the involvement of the fossil fuel industry, I would not do any public engagements. I would kind of have to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And I kind of feel like they would prefer that. So you cannot participate unless you accept some level of relationship with this industry. The personal benefits that I experience in my life here in Norway stem from tax revenue, that most of which is coming from the fossil fuel industry. And so the childcare benefits, the healthcare, education, all these things are, largely related to that line item in our budget that comes from revenues from the fossil fuel industry. Our neighbors, like Sweden and Denmark and Finland, also have good welfare systems, and they don't have massive fossil fuel industries. So I really point to them very frequently and say, you can have good welfare and you don't need to sell the world's most dangerous product to get it. And I really try to enforce that, right? Because our welfare system is not a product of fossil fuels. It's a product of the Scandinavian brain, right? Like, this is how it's done here. And so you kind of have this idea in the country, this feeling among a lot of people that, like, if you were to stop exploration of new fossil fuels or even, plan for the phase down of the existing fossil fuel industry, we have this anxiety like, oh no, we would lose our welfare and we would lose all this stuff. You can find government web pages where they literally depict in a cartoon story life without fossil fuels. This is still live on the government website, where people are literally in caves and, they can't operate their mobile phones or whatever. It's ridiculous, right? So the answer to your question is, we are influenced by this. It is part of our mindset, is that Norway's fossil fuel industry gives us the quality of our lives. And it's just not true. It's literally true in that the money flows from the fossil fuel industry into our budget, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Jim Chalmers just handed down the budget recently, and I was quite surprised looking at the pie chart of where the money comes from, just how much of it is actually income tax. So often on online conversations, you see Australians kind of sniping at Americans going, we got a socialist Medicare system over here. I don't go bankrupt because I got a broken leg. A lot of that is actually coming from income tax in Australia, right? Like, it's not even coming from the supposed, cherry-picked however many billions of dollars that the gas lobby reckons it gives into public coffers. Going back to this tax debate. So you've previously described Norway as a great example of taxing fossil fuels and a terrible example of winding them down. How can both be true at the same time?
Yeah, we implemented a very strict tax on our fossil fuel revenues a long time ago, right? I think this is really Norway's greatest trick, was doing it early, and doing it in a very significant way, right? Like, around 70% of the revenues is taxed. Like that's very significant. And then the other thing that we've done is that the cash that flows from that, we put it into a piggy bank, and that piggy bank is called the oil fund, or Norges investment bank. NBIM, we call it. And this facility becomes a pot of cash that invests in things, right? And so what happens is that we've kind of built up this multi-trillion-dollar investment vehicle. It's massive. It's the world's biggest by a huge margin. And we invest in companies, and the returns that we get from those investments, that gets put into our annual budget. So we're not kind of taking from the piggy bank. We're taking from the added stuff
Profits
on top
of the piggy bank, like the interest and...
That's what funds our welfare system and all of that stuff, right? And what happens there is you get this sense of national ownership over the oil fund, and you get this anxiety that I mentioned earlier that basically relates to this feeling of like it has to keep growing, it has to keep getting bigger. So there's a campaign right now happening from Norway's government to push for more drilling in the Arctic. And, I'm signing on to
Fabulous. Fucking fabulous idea. Let's drill the Arctic.
And again, it's being justified on this whole idea of like, oh, just Europe doesn't have enough fossil fuels. What are we going to do? We know what we should do, right? Like we just need to use less fossil fuels rather than extract more of them. Yeah, exactly. And Europe is, as fast as Europe is going, it's nowhere near as fast as it possibly could be with actual good policies to protect Europe from fossil fuels. So, you look at us domestically, right? And you think like, why do Norwegians support drilling in the Arctic? It's just like, I was so shocked when I found this out because the Arctic feels like such an intensely sensitive natural area and that people would just kind of understand that. The only way I can figure it out is like, oh, we just need to keep filling up the piggy bank. But there was a study done, I think actually probably a year ago now or a little bit more. It just kind of modeled like what would happen if Norway just stopped exploring for new fossil fuels, right? Like not talking about like winding down the existing industry, but just stop exploring for new ones. And of course, right, like we can just live off the investments in the oil fund basically forever and it makes almost no difference. The harm that comes from those fossil fuels is far, far worse than whatever benefits that we get here in Norway from just that little extra bit in our piggy bank that we kind of become addicted to filling up. So I think that is why you have this situation where we correctly deserve credit for just clamping so much control and tax on the industry initially, but it has kind of become separated from the urgency of climate action. And you need to recouple those things if you were to reap the full benefits of having such a good amount of tax on the fossil fuel industry.
Going to the industry in Australia. So looking at the news, the Australian gas lobby keeps using these words like investment, security, reliability. What are those words doing politically?
Yeah, okay. So what we're seeing around the world, it's not just in Australia, but there's been a big push towards, I've seen like those words and some similar ones, sovereignty, like national security. I think you mentioned security. And there are a couple of others that sort of basically all mean the same thing, which is like the world's geopolitics are getting messier and more unstable and scarier. And therefore our wars need to be bigger. We need to be more independent. We need to stop relying on other countries. And we kind of need to have more strength as a unit, as a global unit, a country. And Norway, you hear these lines in Norway as well, and in Europe and in other parts of the world. Yeah, pretty much, right? And particularly Norway's trying to sell gas to Europe, right? Basically saying, we're a reliable partner. You can rely on us. We're your friend. We're Europe's friend. We're on the team.
We're not on the coin, but we're on the team.
Yeah, and we're not in the EU either, but that's a bit of a sensitive point.
That's why the euro looks like a dick, everybody.
Yeah.
Because Norway, you cut Norway off and it looks like a dick.
Exactly. That line is absurd everywhere, right? It's absurd on its own merits because, of course, relying on fuel imports and or exports from other countries, as we know, is the exact cause of the problem here. Like that is the cause of the crisis that we're experiencing, that everybody was relying on either selling or importing fossil fuels to other countries. And that is why we're all suffering. Here in Norway, we have protests against the costs of diesel. Think about that, right? Like Norway, with all the oil and gas that we sell to Europe, there are protests by farmers driving their big tractors down the main street in our city because nobody is actually immune, right? Like you think like, oh yeah, Norway's this amazing fossil fuel superpower. We're going to be protected. That's not how it plays out, right? Like we're interconnected into the power system in Europe. We're interconnected to like just fuel and trade flows. We're exposed to all of the high prices that we both benefit and suffer from. This is not good. Like this is not like a reliable or secure or like sovereign situation. It's actually really, really bad.
It's just like here in Australia, right? Like we are one of the biggest exporters of LNG, of gas. And in Victoria, there has been talk of us buying our own gas back from Japan.
Yeah.
So shipping it from Queensland somewhere in Asia and then buying it back and shipping it directly to Victoria. Like how the fuck are we in such a humiliating situation?
So that's the first part, right? Which is that it's just on its merits. It's a very silly idea. But the flip side is that there are countries that do not care about climate change at all who are now recognizing that fossil fuels suck in about a million different other ways, right? And so China being held on this leash by the US for its oil imports and China still has a lot of like fossil fuel cars, right? Like they have ridiculously good EV deployment. I cannot believe it. If you'd asked me 5 years ago to predict it, I would have said no.
Oh, and even the amount of them you see here in Australia now, like I'm like salivating over the new BYDs that are coming out. I'm looking at this Sea Lion. I'm like, yes, that's my car.
Yes. Yeah. And so they're profiting from the sale, the export of those. China now has a reason to cut its oil use that is really much more material and immediate than the climate imperative. If you were to ask me which one is more important, of course, I would say the climate imperative because that's just my fundamental like focus. But I would be wrong about what feels more immediate and causes more immediate action in that country, right? Like, and I'm not saying this to like talk on their behalf. This is something borne out by the numbers and the decisions that they're making. Their cuts in oil use in particular are really, really amazing. The coal is maybe not so good because they have a lot of domestic coal reserves, right? They don't need to ship it in from Australia quite as much as they have been in the past. So like those lines about like security and reliability, you know, you argue against them as like we should because they're wrong and they have a weird amount of cultural power that they don't deserve because it's absurd, right? Like the whole fossil fuel economy, what is it, like 40% of the world's shipping is transporting fossil fuels from one place to another?
That's fucking grim. And like as an oceans campaigner from way back, like what that does to whales, the noise that creates, the ship strikes,
it's so bad.
It's fucking horrendous. These poor creatures. Something else I wanted to ask you about is that Australians are often told that if we ask for a fairer share of our own resources, that gas corporations will get scared and investment will dry up. What are your thoughts on that?
The gas companies that are investing in Australia are not doing it to help the Australian community, right? Like I see this so much. Yeah, sorry to bring this back to data centers. I got data centers on the brain right now, but tech companies are doing such a similar gambit, right? Where they basically talk about how what they do provides some sort of magical and necessary benefit to society, right? So often they'll talk about like jobs or like the tax revenues they pay when they build something. They talk about the sort of like money flowing into the country from their investment. But then you look at the actual numbers and it's kind of table scraps, right? Like they're kind of just shoving off a little bit of extra shit on the side and going, you keep that tiny amount and we'll keep the rest for ourselves, right? Like I'm sure you've seen all those amazing Punters Politics videos where he basically just explains the math of this, right?
The math doesn't math.
Yeah.
The math does not math.
His outrage is so genuine because it's such a lie, right? And it's kind of true in the literal sense of like, yes, those are table scraps. And if you like table scraps, maybe that's something that you'll be satisfied with.
Please, sir, may I have some more?
Yeah, exactly. But if you look at it from the bigger perspective, and data centers in Australia are kind of doing the same argument where they're like, oh, yeah, you know, we're going to bring in all this like investment X, Y, and Z, but they're not bringing it in, right? Like they are keeping it for themselves. It's going to other countries. And so the whole argument of look how good we are, we're kind of like this gear in your economy that you cannot remove, otherwise everything collapses. That's not real. And not only is it not real, the damage that they do in running their business, it's actually a net harm to you, right? Because even though they'll give you the table scraps, they're kind of stealing from your other resources of X, Y, and Z, you know, whether it's like fuel or water or air or climate. And it's such a huge lie that it's almost hard to know what to feel. Looking at Australia from a distance, maybe this is like a positive thing. I feel like those lines worked really, really well in the sort of 2010s, where it kind of felt like almost, you know, the fossil fuel lobby would do like a press release and it would just be packed with like all the lines that you basically said, right? Which is like, we're bringing in all this cash, we're bringing all these jobs and investment. And it was just like, oh, what can you do? You know, like I'm sure you had this feeling, you know, sometimes maybe something is changing in Australia because it feels like those lines, maybe it's like the sheer power of the gas tax campaign, the social media campaigns, and just the tone and the influence of saying, no, we're not like making a moral argument here. We are disproving a lie. We're kind of showing that they're lying
They've been
to
taking the
you.
piss.
Yes, right? And so, like, framing it all as education that's fighting against a cruel and damaging falsehood has been, I think, just really powerful. I got an ad served to me on my LinkedIn, and it was an Australian energy producers, which is the gas lobby group.
Oh, guys, do better targeting. Don't waste your money.
It was great. It was so good. I was like, thank you. I actually wanted to watch this. And it was a guy, they got an actor who looks a lot like the Pontus Politics guy with like slightly different hair color. And he's holding a beer in his hand. And he's like, well, I'm going to tell you the truth. Let me tell you all the corrections and the facts about, whatever. And it just like, it was so soulless. And like, I looked at it and I was like, is that AI generated or did they get an actor for that? And it was real, right? Like they actually got an actor and they had a script, but it was so without life and pointless that I immediately assumed a machine did it, not a human.
That's a savage take.
Yeah.
Ketan, I just got to stop you there. There is a human being with feelings who created that ad.
I'm sorry, gas lobby person.
There is some poor intern thinking, this is my big break at an advertising agency. Oh, it's a big ad for the gas companies. Oh,
my God.
There is a human being with feelings. There is an actor who is employed. And you know why I could tell that ad was real and that it wasn't fake is because the grading was so bad. AI is really good at saturating with colors, but this was really flat and really grey. It was like whoever filmed
it was like a Nordic crime drama.
Yeah, like they just left it really flat, like straight out of the back of the Blackmagic. It didn't even like bump up the vibrance or anything. It was wild.
Yeah.
But hey, I'm really curious. So something that frustrates me is watching the media and watching the media still accept, and I'm not talking national media because I monitor the media because I work in WA and the NT as well. I monitor the media in both of those states also. And I so often see these gas talking points just being taken at face value by journalists and not challenged and not pushed. What is the one gas lobby talking point you wished journalists would stop taking at face value?
Gosh, that is such a tough question. Only one. Okay. Yes. Okay. No, I know what it is. And I'm going to try and talk about it briefly, and I'm going to try not to
reinforce the frame. Don't reinforce the frame.
I won't reinforce the frame, and I won't get so mad that I just explode. Yeah, okay. So everybody would have heard this in some format, basically, because it's old, right? Like this is not a new talking point. But everybody from the Prime Minister down in the government, in many different political parties, even sometimes in the energy industry says this, which is that we need gas for the renewable energy transition. And it has gotten to the point where people who I love and respect, my friends and colleagues in the clean energy industry, have sometimes started treating gas like it's not a fossil fuel, but rather a clean energy or a climate solution. I get so intensely mad in a bunch of different ways, but to briefly explain why it's wrong, you do not need gas. Gas is a fossil fuel. We are moving away from fossil fuels. Like the reason you're doing the thing is the reason that you don't keep the gas, right? Like like we're getting rid of fossil fuels because they cause harm. And so that's the first point, is that when you burn it, it hurts people. That's why we're not doing it. The second point, and I think this is the one that resonates more with people, is that line is being proved wrong at a rate and a scale that none of us imagined, right? Again, maybe I was like too cynical, but I just wouldn't have predicted it, right? Like if you'd asked me to predict the magnitude of battery installations in Australia or California or Spain or like just any of these countries where it's ramping up like that, like a bloody straight line upwards, I would have been like, no, it would be more gradual than that,
It's making the argument for all these gas peaker plants look so impotent. It's like we've got this very erect line here and then this very small
nuts.
And shrinking argument for gas peaker plants.
Energy Australia announced a week ago, we're expanding our proposed gas peaker from 650 megawatts to 1.3 bloody gigawatts, like doubling it in size, right? And I'm like, wow, how can you possibly justify that? Yeah, right? Doubling the emissions, basically, whatever emissions it'll have, it's double. And I'm just like, how can they justify that? And how can that kind of just be like reported on as like, yeah, well, we are going to need gas as a transition. Blah, blah. So the people in charge of the power grid, they have to plan for the future, right? So they make these sort of forecasts or predictions, and they are kind of like notoriously friendly with gas, right? Like they're kind of like open to the idea of using gas. And even they, in their models, cannot envisage a future where we use more gas on the power grid, right? Even they, like I would argue, excessively generous about having gas there on the grid. The whole idea is that you balance out wind and solar with having a bit of gas when there's no wind and no sun. But batteries are doing that exact purpose at a scale that is unbelievable, right? Like the reports from that same grid manager, they are showing that batteries are cutting into the gas, and they're cutting into gas at the best possible time, which is the evening peak when we're all using the most amount of energy. That is when gas makes everything the most expensive because they're called on it. There's like the emergency backup, and emergency backup is expensive. But batteries are like, well, we charged up with solar in the middle of the day, so we basically paid bloody nothing to charge our batteries. So we'll charge you $1, you know, like we'll charge you almost nothing. So of course they're crowding out gas in the evening because gas is like, oh, I'm going to charge you a huge amount of money because gas is very expensive right now.
You can't sit with
And
us.
so,
Go away, gas.
yeah. So when like Albanese or Angus Taylor or Pauline Hanson, like anyone says you need gas for the energy transition, first of all, they're probably talking about some gas field that is like 50 times more gas than what is modeled by that grid operator, even in their generous models, right? Secondly, that is going from like a misleading talking point to being an extremely serious and significant lie. And I don't use the word lie lightly at all, right? I cannot believe how this keeps being said and people are like, oh yeah, that's true. You do need gas for the energy transition. No, like you, not only do you not need it, we never needed gas for the energy transition, right?
So Anthony Albanese's lying to us.
Anthony Albanese is absolutely lying when he says that we need gas to balance out the energy transition or the deployment of renewables. That is such a huge lie. You do not need it. You really, really don't need it, right? Batteries are like designed perfectly to get rid of gas reliance. What Australia definitely does need is more like bulk renewables, right? Like Australia really, really needs more construction of wind and solar to get rid of coal. That is the other side of the story, right? Coal is not being phased out as fast as it should be. The reason for that is not because coal is so good that we need it for longer, but because we need more wind and solar like to be built more quickly.
So talking about Anthony Albanese, I'm really curious as to why Australian journalists don't interrogate the motives of some of the decisions that the Labor government makes on gas policy. Something that really stunned me earlier on in my career. I saw a report from Market Forces that showed just how much money from the coal, oil and gas companies that the Labor Party takes. And it's in the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And then when you count dark money, if not millions of dollars, why is it, do you think, that Australian journalists just don't better connect the dots and interrogate some of those policy decisions?
The nicest way to put it is that there is a real bias towards the status quo. I don't think that, like, I don't sort of look at those stories where they just ignore such a clear and significant motivation as a relevant factor as being really pro-fossil fuels, right? You don't get the vibe that most of them actually genuinely love the gas industry or the coal industry. I think it's more the case that they genuinely love centrist ideology relating to just keeping things as they are and not really challenging the structure or the systems that are in place today. And challenging this idea that you can impugn someone's motivation, that you can interrogate it and go, let's look at the bigger picture and where the money's flowing and what might be the cause of this, is seen as almost rude because it's not what he said. Albanese didn't stand up and literally say, hey, everyone, I'm announcing this new gas field because I was donated, $2 million by whatever this fossil fuel company.
Woodside said so.
Yeah, like he doesn't say it. And there's this literal mindedness around it where it's like, oh, well, if he didn't say it, how could we possibly know? And you know what? Sometimes you kind of just have to look at the system or the structure and say, part of the problem here is the system. And if they were to name the system as the problem, then all of a sudden you can't really push for the status quo. You suddenly become an activist, and there's a
Mm.
real fear of being seen as an activist among not just Australian journalists, but many other journalists. The thing that I like the most about journalism is when they become active in pushing for changes to society for the better.
Mm.
They do it in almost every other area. Look at like medicine or health reporting. They will report on like a disease as being bad, even though that's being activist against the disease. That's just not unusual. But for fossil fuels, it's like, oh, no, we can't really interrogate it too much, or we don't want to be seen as biased.
Now, speaking of balanced and centrist worldviews, One Nation has just dropped its new gas policy. It's Norway inspired, where gas corporations get a 30% tax break in exchange for Australia having the option to take a 30% stake in new projects. What is your take on that?
It's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating, right? I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a political party in Australia with such intense, clear climate denialism, but a policy on fossil fuels that is actually, on the face of it, like an outright crony capitalist fossil fuel subsidy. So I think a lot of people probably saw that announcement and they were like, oh, that's interesting. It's kind of like nuanced, like they're almost like wanting to nationalize the coal and gas industry. But then you spend like half a second looking at it and it's like, oh, no, it's a fossil fuel subsidy. They really just want to dump the risk that fossil fuel companies in Australia are collecting like fucking coins, and the industry is desperate to not hold that risk themselves. They want to dump it on the public. And One Nation, I mean, I don't know if they've got like a new political advisor or something, but like it was clever I mean that in the worst possible way, in the most evil way, to basically
Diabolical.
label it. Yeah, really diabolical. To label it with this very genuine push to put real responsibility back on the fossil fuel companies. But the actual details are like just dumping the risk of stranded assets and this bubble of huge fossil fuel projects onto the public, right? And so, of course, the fossil fuel industry welcomed it, right? Like the fact that the fossil fuel industry welcomed this
shows you all you need to know about the policy, right?
It's so bad. It was so lovely to see so much like direct criticism. There was a great video from Get Up from the guy who's in all those Get Up videos. It was so great because he was just like, no, this is a fossil fuel subsidy. Kind of just been labeled. Like what One Nation is proposing is basically nothing like Norway, right? Like it's just ridiculous to compare it to Norway. We have massive government intervention and state control. Yes, Norway and One Nation both do not want to wind down the fossil fuel industry to protect our safety, but that's about the only thing that's in common there, right? One Nation's position, when I read it, I was like, that's the United States position, which is that they're not totally against government intervention either. What they want is the government to intervene so that the companies are protected from the public. That is the state control being proposed here, right? Which is that, yes, the state is involved very heavily, but the whole point is to make sure that the rich executives get as much cash as possible when all the walls inevitably come crashing down. They are planning for the collapse of the fossil fuel industry. One Nation and Trump want the industry protected from accountability and from public outrage. I was so shocked when I saw that because I was like, you sneaky bastards. Just labeling it with like the bloody Norway thing, because that is just not what we do here, right? As much as I have criticisms for Norway's structure and its attitudes towards oil and gas, we're not the US, and the US is a very different style. And I kind of wish that like media outlets had recognized the trick that One Nation was pulling there. I mean, this is a gripe that I've had since I was, a tiny child in Australia, right? Which is that One Nation really doesn't get the scrutiny that it deserves from media.
But it's because people don't take them seriously. And it's like we've had not one but two MRP polls. It's a public opinion poll that uses a shit ton of modelling to predict seat-by-seat outcomes if an election were held today. And we've had not one but two MRP polls come out that show that One Nation, if an election would be held today, One Nation would be the opposition. And that is, I don't know if you've seen those. I'll pop them up on screen. Absolutely fucking terrifying stuff. And so we're in a position now where the media is used to not taking One Nation seriously and used to not applying the level of scrutiny that they should apply to a party that could plausibly be the opposition after the next election.
Yeah, I have to mention as well, I grew up in Australia as a little brown dude, in the 1990s and the 2000s. And, One Nation and Pauline Hanson were prominent from the moment we arrived in the mid-1990s. She has been a force in Australian politics for my entire childhood, plus my entire sort of awakened political life when I joined the wind industry and politics. And I've been very genuinely scared of both ideologies that she and her party bring to Australian politics, which is A, significantly worsened racism, and B, fossil fuel advocacy and climate denialism. I don't even really have anything insightful to say about either of those things other than that they scare me in a way that has never left me. Even leaving the country, I still find it scary. I have so many friends and family in Australia that it terrifies me quite a lot. And one thing in particular that I really am sensitive to is when an organization or a person starts to mimic the language of One Nation in a way of kind of taking this lesson of their rise in popularity means they're doing something right. So we kind of have to copy their style or their language or their positions. And I think that's exactly the wrong. I know people have different views about this, but I think that's exactly the wrong lesson to take. I think that you need to go to the heart of why people are pissed and then actually propose a real solution instead of the fake solution. One Nation are basically capitalizing on that outrage with the goal of making the cause of that outrage worse. And the fact that the world's fossil fuel crisis is caused directly by Donald Trump, the ideological partner of Pauline Hanson, and that hasn't affected Hanson's popularity in Australia is really shocking and interesting to me. And I think that maybe bringing her closer back to capitalism and the sort of dirty money of the fossil fuel, there are lots of really great influencers and accounts I follow who are doing this so well. They talk about her gross little private jet. They talk about Gina Reinhart. And I think this is really important. I think that's exactly the right approach to be taking. Attack her. She has a bad position and she's misleading people. I think it's good to be on the offensive.
Ketan Joshi, it has been an absolute joy having you on the show today. Thank you so, so much for your time. And I really hope it's not the last time.
Thank you for having me. I will come back anytime.
If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to leave a comment, a review, and share it with someone hot. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram at The Nelli Stevenson Show.